We good? Yeah, okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this gorgeous June evening. We're inside, we're air conditioning, and we can look outside and see how beautiful it is and listen to what I know is going to be a wonderful talk. I know that because about a year ago this time, Ashli presented something on this book for our Mount Vernon Spring Symposium, and we all were so blown away. We said we have to bring her back and share her with our audience again, a different audience, our public lectures audience. So we're really thrilled to have Ashli with us tonight. I know many of you know me. I'm Patrick Spiro. I'm the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library. I also want to thank the Ford Motor Company for sponsoring our Ford Evening Book Talks. They've been sponsoring these talks now for over 100 years. It's maybe one of the longest continuous corporate sponsorships in the United States. We say that. No one's corrected us, so must be true, right? I'm on video too, right? But I just want to make everyone aware of a few other events that are coming up that they might be of interest. This Friday, we're having one of our lunchtime map chats. These are talks that focus on our dynamic and rich and deep map collection. Our talk this Friday is going to be on a map from 1775 of New York, a Montresor map. Even though it's on the eve of the Revolution, our curator who's going to be talking about it is going to be talking about how it helps us understand the coming of the American Revolution, the imperial crisis, because a lot of the information was written in the 1760s and 1770s when the British Empire was trying to imagine this land as their own. And here it is printed in 1775, just as the Americans are trying to say, no, this is our land, not yours. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating talk. That's this Friday at lunch. Bring your own lunch if you want to join us. And then we have a lunch at the library on June the 10th. That's Monday. I know, there's a lot. This is one of those where we provide the lunch. You have to purchase a ticket. And we have a talk called Embracing Your Past to Empower Your Future. And it's a book that studies four families and whose loved ones were enslaved. So it's looking at the legacy of slavery. And that'll be on June the 10th, lunch at the library. And then finally, our next evening talk, which is our Martha Washington lecture, is going to feature the authors Diana Carlin, Anita McBride, and Nancy Keegan, who just published a book, Remember the First Ladies, The Legacies of America's History-Making Women. So it's a book that studies all the first ladies. And of course, they begin with the first one, Martha Washington herself, and I'm sure she'll be the subject of the Martha Washington lecture. And now to introduce Ashli, who's come all the way from Miami to join us, where she is just recently promoted to Professor of History. How recent?
June 1st.
All right. So is this your first lecture as a professor? All right. Wow. She is a noted scholar on early American history, especially the Atlantic world and the age of revolutions. She's the author not only of this book, but also Encountering Revolution, Haiti, and the Making of the Early Republic, which explores the impact of the Haitian Revolution on the early United States and its politics and society. She's also had a number of different roles, including associate curator and co-author of the catalog for Antillean Visions, which was an exhibition at the Lowe Art Museum. And it charted over 500 years of Caribbean maps. So you're a map expert as well. You might want to zoom in on Friday. And she has a BA from the University of Virginia up the road, an MA from the Winterthur program in early American culture, and her PhD from Columbia University. And tonight, she's going to talk about her most recent book, Revolutionary Things, Material Culture, and the Politics in the Late 18th-Century Atlantic World. Ashli?
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks to Patrick for that lovely introduction. Thanks to Stephen, who I hear is under the weather after the symposium, for making these arrangements, and Megan as well. And thank you to the fantastic volunteers at Mount Vernon who have been lovely in making sure I am at the right place at the right time. So I'm very grateful for that. I'll begin tonight with a story. So in the winter of 1790-1791, authorities in northern Saint-Domingue were very interested in the contents of this man's luggage. That autumn, Vincent Auger and a group of like-minded free men of African descent had taken up arms. Their goal was to compel the colonial assembly to acknowledge the political rights granted to some Black men by the revolutionary legislature in Paris. After a standoff of several weeks, the dissidents were apprehended, charged with insurrection, and condemned to execution. Before the sentence was carried out, however, government officials sought to learn more about the scope of the insurgents' designs. As part of their investigation into Auger, they searched his possessions and discovered things that they suspected had abetted his campaign. Authorities inventoried reformist pamphlets gathered during his recent stay in Paris, and they pressed him about weapons allegedly procured in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, given Auger's aim to extend rights by force to free men of African descent, the guns and revolutionary tracks were predictable. But investigators also inquired about objects that, from our vantage, are less expected. Early in the interview, they quizzed Auger about a trip to the Sèvres porcelain factory and the thousands of livres worth of coffee wares that he had acquired there and then sold. They wondered how he had afforded such a hefty outlay, and if it was true that he had worn a National Guard uniform to the factory visit. And you can see him here wearing that uniform. At another session, they referenced his engraved portrait, copies of which were in his bag. They wanted to know whether he had devised the motto, quote, "He loves liberty and knows how to defend it," that encircled his silhouette. On one of the last days of questioning, they brought in items from his trunk, including several military garments that the clerk described in detail, right down to the imported metal buttons stamped with the arms of Paris. They concluded the show and tell by unveiling some pieces of jewelry, among which were two small ceramic medallions depicting a chained slave in bas-relief. In his responses, Auger downplayed the political significance of his things. He claimed that the jewelry was for his commercial work, that the Parisian printer had composed the slogan on his portrait, and that the uniforms were merely a requirement of his militia commission. None were intended, as he put it, to excite revolt on the island. Authorities remained unconvinced by these denials, as Auger no doubt anticipated. Everyone in that interrogation room knew that these objects thrummed with meaning, but the officials' persistent questions and Auger's resolute disclaimers suggest that their revolutionary implications were up for discussion. And these contentious exchanges encourage us to ask, how and why did these objects provoke strong reactions? What do they reveal not only about Auger's quest for political rights, but about the power of material culture in the age of Atlantic revolutions more broadly? So my book seeks to answer these questions for the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, political movements that generated radical new ideas and that influenced the production, circulation, and consumption of millions of things. I show that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, material culture shaped in distinct ways how people understood vital keywords, such as equality and freedom, and how they tried to promote and thwart the realization of these ideals on the ground. Crucially, these contests occurred at the level of everyday life. The clothes on individuals' backs, the plates from which they ate, the maps that guided their movements, the diversions that amused them. And these engagements involved enslaved and free, women and men, poor and elite, whose encounters with objects were not limited to local concerns. Rather, through things, actors across the social spectrum contributed to transatlantic ideological disputes. So to locate these contributions, Revolutionary Things reconsiders the intersection between politics and material culture. Typically, we assess the political potential of objects within the context of individual revolutions. But as Auger's case indicates, these movements transcended national borders and so did the material culture associated with them. So I track the Atlantic trajectories of diverse categories of objects. So I look at ceramics, metalware, and furniture, military clothing and accessories, maps and prints. You should really go to the map discussion that's coming up at the library, clearly. This is the undercurrent of the paper. And I also look at life-size wax figures. Right? Now, some of these things originated at a revolutionary site and voyaged beyond it, while others were fabricated outside of the United States, France, or Haiti, but referred to those places. So, for instance, British or American-made items about the French and Haitian revolutions. But I'll spare you decapitated heads for a while. All right, so the political influence of these border-eliding objects differed from that of texts. And identifying their singular impact requires an active view of material culture. There's a tendency to see objects as straightforward badges of political positions. But objects do not simply transmit fixed messages. Material culture theorists and practitioners stress that people affect things and that things affect lives in fundamental and sometimes unforeseen ways. So to understand an object's political residence, then, we need to pay closer attention to what is often called its materiality, and that has several components. First, the traits unique to a type of object, military clothing versus printed portraits, for instance, that figured in its political capacity. I explore how uniforms engaged with questions over equality, whereas printed portraits influenced debates about popular sovereignty. Second, not only did different objects speak to different issues, but each category had limits that were distinct to its form as well. These bounds were structural in terms of where and of what things were made. So an object's political possibilities were determined in part if it could be and was produced in Cap Français or Philadelphia or Paris, and whether it was comprised of cloth or paper or ceramic. The limits of revolutionary things were also socially constructed, and that people had thresholds for tolerating alterations to aspects of their material worlds and to those of others. Some individuals were more willing and more able to change their dress accessories than their dinnerware. And lastly, context affected political influence. An object could promote or check change depending on who acquired and used it, how, where, and to what ends. So a queensware platter owned by an enslaved person in Virginia had political valences distinct from one found in the Duc d'Orléans' household, for example. So this tension across and within revolutionary things made them sites of contest, as people teased out political prospects and encountered obdurate restrictions in the world of things. So I focus on this contest in the heat of the moment from about 1770 to 1810, when participants and observers wrestled with events, agents, and ideas as they surfaced. The quick succession of these three revolutions, and in the case of France and Haiti, their simultaneity, that facilitates our inquiry into the effects of objects on the revolutionary present, instead of their role in nationalism or commemorations of the revolutionary past. So in so doing, I look to recover the dynamism of Atlantic revolutionary things for the many individuals who interacted with them. So to show this approach in action, let me draw your attention to the book's cover, which is not only aesthetically lovely, like I really like the cover of this book, but it also has an argument. All right. So in a work about revolutionary material culture, it is not surprising to include a miniature of Toussaint Louverture, right? This visual representation of the Haitian revolutionary leader fits nicely in the category of revolutionary things, right? As do the items that are featured in the portrait. You can see he's wearing a uniform. He has a cockade on his hat. He has a map in his hands, right? But the Sèvres vase, which dates from 1779, seems a bit of an outlier. When it comes to revolutionary ceramics, we might expect something more like this teapot, right? Or this plate, right? One from the French Revolution, right? Tonight, I want to make a case as to why this vase belongs next to the medallion of Toussaint Louverture. How this Ancien Régime object, along with others like it, redefines what was a revolutionary thing, and in the process, it helps us to identify new and significant aspects of the politicization of objects in this era. Okay, so the Sèvres vase is a prime example of a luxury good. Made of porcelain and decorated with gilt and deftly painted enamel scenes, it took years to fabricate. And only the very wealthiest, in this case, Louis XVI, could afford it. And he was Louis XVI, so he bought a pair of them, right? Okay. So luxury came under fire during the age of revolutions as reformers decried these types of items as visible manifestations of the decadence that corrupted political systems. In some instances, Republicans destroyed fine furnishings as they ransacked the properties of rulers, officials, and other political foes. This iconoclasm has received a lot of scholarly attention because it illustrates how revolutionaries were determined to sweep out the old and bring in the new. And yet the Sèvres vase, which graced the council room at Versailles, it endured the revolutions, as did heaps of other high-style furnishings affiliated with ancien regimes. Their continued presence was essential to revolutions, in part because of their value. This evening, we'll examine how conceptions of the value of luxury goods encouraged their appropriation by revolutionaries who attempted to repurpose them for radical, if often unstable, ends. Right. Recall how Auger financed his military endeavor to Saint-Domingue. He purchased coffee wares at Sèvres, and then he resold them in Paris. This practice of acquiring and reselling desirable wares was pervasive among other soldiers at the time, but with one exception. While Auger bought goods from the manufactory, armies and navies frequently plundered them from their enemies. During the Revolutionary Wars, as with other armed conflicts, governments encouraged pillaging within certain parameters because it debilitated and humiliated foes, right? And the spoils helped to underwrite the victor's campaign. So militaries, for instance, seized items of immediate use to their forces, right? Ammunition, food, horses, right? But they also gathered materials with an eye to their saleability on the secondhand market. In the early modern period, the trade in previously owned items was as substantial in terms of volume and worth as the retail market. And some scholars speculate that the sale of old wares even surpassed that of new. Not all of this activity resulted from plunder, right, clearly, but the lively secondhand market supplied a ready and familiar mechanism through which to dispense with and profit from goods seized in wartime. So as one auctioneer explained, quote, "A British military invasion proclaims a kind of fair, which is welcome in the West Indies. The variety of things arriving for sale and the wider markets open to produce increase circulation." Now, during the revolutions, militaries looked to plunder goods that would maximize revenue, and enemy merchants were a tempting target. When the British seized the Dutch colony of St. Eustatius during the American Revolution, soldiers raided warehouses for tropical produce, casks of sugar, coffee, and tobacco, which could be consumed by armies or it could be hawked, right? They also collected silk gloves, girls' Morocco pumps, petticoats, shoe buckles, parcels of lace and ribbons, napkins and tablecloths, and 25 shirts trimmed with stitch cambric ruffles. Right, and this print is a send up of that. You can see Rodney on the right side of the rostrum, who is selling. He's like looking for bids on a shoe buckle, right, and trying to drive up the price. And the advertisement in the back tells you the things for sale: hats, buttons, gloves, umbrellas, wigs, sleeve buttons. This is satire, but the documentation from St. Eustatius tells us that it's very close to the mark, perhaps like uncomfortably so for somebody like Rodney. Now, we usually do not think of military men collecting girls' pumps and ruffled shirts as plunder, right? But they sought them out because they sold well on the secondhand market. So while merchant stock might have been easy pickings, the same calculus informed seizures of property from private estates. So in North America, patriots confiscated and sold the household goods of suspected loyalists. Martha Phillips of Boston submitted a list to the Loyalist Claims Commission for over 500 pounds worth of property that included pictures that were gilt and framed and glazed, china and glass, and 24 walnut chairs. Okay. In these scenarios, the identification of elite trappings came at the behest of officers, men of standing who were familiar with the ins and outs of the consumer world, men like Admiral Rodney on the rostrum. Yet evidence suggests that when it came to plundering, people at various social levels understood the value of diverse goods. Take, for example, the case of ordinary soldiers. In the aftermath of battles, men inevitably lifted items for themselves, and the individuals affected decried these appropriations as unjust and cited them as evidence of the moral waywardness of plunderers, which had political currency in an age of revolutions. For our purposes, these episodes reveal how members of the lower sort knew the value and resale potential of luxury items. In the fall of 1776, General George Washington heard scores of complaints about plundering by his men. In one case, a group of foot soldiers ransacked a house, taking with them, among other objects, 4 large pier-looking glasses, which, as the reporting officer remarked, one would think could be of no earthly use to them. Right? When ordered to return these goods, the ringleader refused to do so and swore that he and his accomplices would, quote, defend them at the hazard of their life. The incident shows how the acquisition of highest style goods had the potential to upset social hierarchies, right? As these men not only demonstrated their awareness of luxury items and their value, but they also claimed a right to them, right, and to defend them. The political significance of appropriation and resale was even more powerful in the case of Black men. Throughout the Age of Revolutions, white observers tried to deny that Black people had knowledge of material culture typically associated with the master class. And yet the actions of Black people belie this denial. In North America, Black loyalist soldiers, quote, took everything valuable from patriot homes. And in one instance, this included bedding, wearing apparel, liquors, and a watch. During the Haitian Revolution, white San-Domingans griped about losing clothing, silver, and books to Black revolutionaries. In the fall of 1791, a colonist returned to his plantation to find that rebels had destroyed everything except one building, which was inhabited by the local leader of the insurrection. The formerly enslaved had stocked it with the planter's best furniture, all of which, he noted, was carefully maintained, a clear sign that people of African descent recognized its worth. This display of familiarity with the value of luxury goods challenged racist notions that denigrated the capacity of people of African descent to comprehend those so-called finer points of civilization. It also mattered how these items were taken. In the age of revolutions, white observers often portrayed the military maneuvers of Black people as wild abandon, again, in an effort to uphold racial hierarchical fictions and to argue against emancipation. Things like this print, the Pillage du Camp Français in 1793, where you can see a kind of carnivalesque seizure of goods taking place. Sensitive to these kinds of depictions, Black armies in revolutionary Saint-Domingue organized plundering as much as possible, right? In other words, they knew the optics of what they were doing. So during the Battle of Le Cap in 1793, men of African descent systematically emptied the richest storehouses. A Boston merchant who witnessed the event described its meticulous coordination in which long lines of mules were brought to the port and Black troops oversaw their loading. He wrote, quote, "The whole bay for nearly 3/4 of a mile was stripped of its merchandise, and other parts of town were doubtless plundered in the same manner." So rather than unbridled looting, Black armies selected and gathered what they needed in an orderly fashion, and to good effect, as estimates of this single episode's take ranged from 3 to 10,000 livres. Now, like their white counterparts, Black armies sold these items to support their aims. And in the case of Saint-Domingue, one outlet for these goods was neighboring Santo Domingo. In the early years of the revolution, Black armies carried plunder to Spanish authorities in exchange for war material. Colonial officials promoted this practice, hoping that Black forces would undercut French control to such an extent that the Spanish would swoop in and conquer the entire island. Right? But Black armies had their own agendas for leveraging plunder. When Spanish colonial administrators could not keep pace with Black troops' demands for supplies, they began to sell items directly to Cuban soldiers who were stationed in Santo Domingo. These men bought thousands of pesos worth of furniture, jewels, plate, and even sugar processing equipment, all pillaged from estates and warehouses in Saint-Domingue. On the one hand, these sales speak to Black soldiers' savviness about what was viable on the secondhand market and how to take advantage of that arena to support a political and military cause determined to overturn the planters' world in Saint-Domingue. On the other hand, the subversive potential was circumscribed in that buyers used these items, like sugar equipment shipped from Hispaniola to Cuba, to bolster slavery elsewhere. As this case suggests, the political resonances of pillaged goods continued after their sale. While all three revolutions distributed items across borders, the French revolutionary confiscations afford the best opportunity to explore the implications of the consumption of pillaged goods. And this is for two reasons: the quantity of goods seized and their appeal among a certain subset of consumers in Europe and the Americas. So beginning in late 1789, the French government impounded the real and movable property of the Catholic Church. As the revolution radicalized, the net widened to include émigrés and political criminals, some of whom were the wealthiest men and women in France. The most high-profile example was the royal family. Right? The contents of their chateau, Versailles, Fontainebleau, among others, they became the property of the nation. The official term for them in French was biens nationaux, like national goods. The windfall was enormous, as millions of luxury goods entered public coffers. Now, some of these items were earmarked as cultural patrimony and were transferred to a central depot in Paris with the intention that they would be preserved and displayed for the people's edification. The Louvre, once a private palace, was transformed into a public museum in 1793 for this very purpose. Right? But the pressure of the goods was enormous, and the regime was strapped for cash, and so it decided to sell many items at auction. They couched these sales in patriotic terms, calling on French people to purchase wares to support the nation. Despite these appeals, the local consumer base could not absorb the massive quantity of items, and the regime turned to foreign buyers who, they reasoned, would introduce stable currency into an economy suffering from ever-increasing levels of inflation. Consumers throughout the Atlantic world snapped up these wares in the 1790s. Now, to be sure, these auctions targeted well-heeled clientele, which is one of the reasons we can trace them, right? They were prized among bidders then and by collectors ever since. Nevertheless, thanks to the French Revolution, these luxury goods became accessible to a wider swath of buyers. The new owners were still elites, but often aspiring ones, and several were avowed Republicans. Some eager purchasers were on the spot, all ready to make the most of the bonanza, but French merchants also offered to ship items abroad. So Citizen Ibert, who was a Paris décréteur, he placed advertisements in German newspapers, emphasizing that he offered, quote, superior confiscated items at modest prices. Extant networks of trade expedited the movement of these wares, too. Throughout the 1790s, James Christie, the famous London auctioneer, used his professional contacts to ensure a steady supply of confiscated items. In his catalogs from the 1790s, he advertised, as you can see here, Madame du Barry's diamonds, bronze statues saved from the Tuileries, and other items that had been owned by household royalist names from the French Revolution. The sale of biens nationaux created opportunities for establishing new channels of Atlantic circulation. Consider the dealings of the merchant James Swan. A Scotsman who had migrated to Massachusetts during the North American colonial crisis, Swan threw himself into political ventures. He joined the Sons of Liberty and served in the state legislature and the War Board. By 1791, he had moved to Paris, where he parlayed his Republican credentials into commercial gains. Swan proposed that his firm would facilitate the importation of food and stores to France from the United States in exchange for access to and permission to export biens nationaux. Through this arrangement, Swan shuttled shiploads of French luxury goods to buyers everywhere from Boston to Norfolk. And as part of the deal, Swan purchased a cache of spectacular items for his home back in Dorchester, Massachusetts. So he bought the sub vase that's on the front of the book. And like Louis XVI, he wanted two, so he got both. He bought a marble top console table. He bought a mahogany fall front desk and chest of drawers. Yeah. He bought a pair of gilt bronze andirons, which you see on the right, as a bronze mantel clock, right? And an entire suite of bedroom furniture, right? The bed I showed at the beginning as part of the sort of roll of objects, that's Swan's bed. Now, we might be tempted to chalk up Swan's spending spree, as well as those of many others, to greed. Right? When individuals encountered so many amazing items at bargain prices, political principles caved to consuming desires and to social aspirations. These motivating factors were at play. Right? But this explanation stops short of appreciating the political associations that traveled with these objects into their new settings. The revolutions that made them available were hard to shake, and yet also hard to pin down in the heat of the moment, revealing for us the instability and also the incredible power of these things. A brief comparison between British and US consumers helps us see this dynamic in action. As Christie's dealings suggest, Britain was an active outlet for biens nationaux. Although sworn enemies of France for most of the 18th century, British consumers still admired French high style, and this veneration did not wane during the Revolution. Some observers criticized the British elite for their Francophilia, But after 1793, with the execution of Louis XVI and the French declaration of war on Britain, buyers could claim a political impetus for their purchases. They justified their taste as a sign of solidarity with the ever-dwindling pool of French royals and for monarchy generally. Moreover, they argued it was a way of raiding France of its cultural spoils, and cheaply at that. As one commentator exclaimed, quote, "What a triumph for the English if it would be able to crush French commerce by the annihilation of its industrial and decorative arts from which the culture enriches itself." None other than the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, was swept up in the frenzy. He obtained numerous pieces and piles of furniture that he would eventually install at Windsor Castle. Right? Now, the experiences of Gouverneur Morris illustrate some of the political reverberations of French things in the United States. Morris served, he's the one seated, as U.S. Minister of France during the Terror, and he purchased several items from Versailles while in Paris as U.S. Minister to France. He bought a musical clock and sewing table, which he shipped to Robert and Mary Morris. Robert is standing in the portrait in Philadelphia. The clock was such a sensation that city residents went to see it at the shop of a local clockmaker, like when it arrived. They knew the whole backstory about it belonging to Marie Antoinette, right? You can imagine. Now, for himself, Gouverneur Morris acquired a suite of furniture, at least 2 sofas, several armchairs, one of which you see here, and a screen that had outfitted one of the cabinets in Marie Antoinette's private apartments. Now, Morris's Versailles purchases appeared in the parlor of his estate, Mauriciana, located in what is now the South Bronx, and its display in the most public room of his house invites several interpretations. Its conspicuous placement may have been Morris's way of honoring the French-U.S. alliance of 1778. Yet Morris was well aware of the dramatic changes in France that had made the Versailles suite available, namely the demise of the monarch who had allied with the United States. In the spring of 1789, Morris had professed his disdain for the opulence of Versailles. He was indignant over the royal family's willful ignorance of how their lavish spending had contributed to the financial crisis. As the revolution deepened, Morris wondered whether the king, for all of his good intentions, was up to the task, as he put it, of securing the liberty of France. And at several moments, he lamented Marie Antoinette's imprudent conduct. At the same time, Morris criticized the revolutionaries, detailing in his diary and official correspondence their intrigues and rash decisions and the general chaos they unleashed. At the end of 1792, Morris penned an in-depth appraisal of the French Revolution, in which almost all participants shared the blame. Revolutionaries of all stripes, the royal family, courtiers, and the populace, among others. The problem, in Morris's estimation, was that the French were not ready for the revolution they had inaugurated and perpetuated. In this context, Morris's Versailles suite takes on many more possible meanings. It represented the recklessness of the former owner, as well as that of the revolutionaries from moderate to radical who brought her down. It served as a poignant reminder of how quickly one's political and personal fortunes could turn. Or perhaps Gouverneur Morris agreed with Thomas Jefferson, who thought that Americans should only imbibe French culture once their moral compasses were fully forged at home. In this vein, Morris could have seen himself as preserving for Americans the very thing most valuable from France, its culture, a move not so distant from British counterparts. So the practice of pillaging set millions of old regime goods in motion during the Age of Atlantic Revolutions, and the sheer volume broadened the range of revolutionary things that inhabitants encountered. Although none of these items was explicitly Republican in aesthetics, they elicited discussions about revolutions because of the context surrounding their seizures, sales, and uses. There's a temptation to dismiss these secondhand goods as holdovers from another era, but this explanation falls prey to the period's polarizing rhetoric that tried to cast individuals as either for or against the status quo. Political allegiances on the ground, even among self-avowed revolutionaries like Morris, were much less sure. In fact, the starkness of the rhetoric can in part be attributed to the need to clarify allegiances. If, for example, the iconography of liberty, equality, and fraternity that we saw on faience, right, and the teapot furniture and other items, if that represented the ideal, what revolutionaries wanted to achieve, then these old goods, like the Sèvres vase, encapsulated the messiness of the revolutionary present and how much remained unresolved. For us, they offer insight into the contingency of the moment as individuals struggled to make sense of the revolutions as they occurred. And they point to the ways that material continuity perpetuated revolutionary change and shaped how various individuals understood the content of that change. So in closing, I hope that I've convinced you that a Louis XVI Sèvres vase belongs on this book cover, right, alongside the Toussaint Louverture miniature. Though I don't think the press is going to change it. So, all right. So what might seem like a juxtaposition, right, is a truer reflection of the diverse types of things that held political currency in this era. And there's one more argument in this pairing. This vase depicts a scene from the life of Belisarius, a brilliant and tenacious general who served in the Byzantine Empire during the reign of Justinian I, and who was wrongfully charged and imprisoned for conspiracy. 18th century French elites embraced a romanticized version of Belisarius's biography, seeing it as a sign of fortitude in the face of unjust circumstances. So when this vase stood in Versailles, Louis XVI drew a parallel between himself and this hero. But the orientation of the book cover suggests perhaps that Toussaint Louverture is a more fitting exemplar. A central goal of this book is to encourage new questions of material culture, an endeavor which I think is imperative for understanding this historic watershed. A material review is important because things were, and they still are, vital to human existence, perhaps more so than text, the usual source for histories of revolutionary politics. Whether enslaved or free, poor or elite, male or female, late 18th century individuals lived in material worlds in which people acted on things and were affected by them too. So given this fundamental condition, we cannot comprehend the achievements and limitations of this defining era without taking the consequences of things seriously. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Professor White.
Thank you. Well done, Patrick.
I think we have some time for questions. I was writing down a few myself, one of which you answered, which was I wanted to know how the vase got to Boston, and it was through Colonel Swan.
Exactly.
So I might ask you another question that came to mind after that, which was when you were talking about Robert Morris and how the acquisition of these very, it's the ancient regime, it's decadence, it's the thing, that phrase you had, the visible manifestation of the decadence that was corrupting Europe. They were now acquiring these. Did these objects at all become political within the American party system? I mean, because Jefferson is also, a huge supporter of France, acquiring stuff, and Robert Morris is on the other side of the political divide. Like, are these politicized at all in America?
I think among the emerging or American U.S. elite, they all want to get their hands on this stuff if they can, right? Like in the same way that British aristocrats want to get their hands on their stuff. I mean, I mean, the things are, like, they have not seen the likes of this before, nor had the opportunity to acquire them. So it is something that cuts across Federalists and Democratic Republicans. One could argue it's like a common material culture language. And so no matter what they might think about the ramifications of the French Revolution, they're on board with buying this stuff if they can get it at a good price.
Thanks.
Would you talk about how the determination was made whether or not to reimburse people who lost items in revolution? I mean, in America, how widespread was it? Did it occur at all after the French Revolution and things had settled down?
In terms of people being able to reclaim what they had lost?
Not reclaim, but actually get reimbursed
Right.
for
Okay,
what
so-
they had lost.
Sure. So the Loyalist Claims Commission, American royalists who are able to make their way to London, they press these cases. And actually at the David Library at APS, one can find microfilm versions of many of the cases. And we know that this happened in several colonies and states. What's remarkable is that loyalists, some of them are there watching their own things being auctioned, and they're writing down the auction price, but their valuation price, and saying, actually, it should have gotten more because these are worth more. But the British government is never able to compensate them in the way that they feel fully compensated. In the case of Saint-Domingue, you also see the planter class, many of whom fled. Some of them ended up refugees in the United States, some ended up in France. There's a large diaspora. In the 1820s, they filed for compensation from the French government what they had lost. And there are these fat dossiers of French planters enumerating, and their descendants, actually some of them had died, enumerating what they had lost. And when, in order for Haiti to be recognized as an independent nation by France, so unlike the conclusion of the American Revolution in 1789, and in 1883, which included in that treaty a recognition of the United States as an independent nation, Haiti is not recognized as an independent nation by France until 1826. To do so, they must pay an indemnity to France, which then is dispersed among those descendants. In terms of within France itself, is an even messier situation because of the Napoleonic Wars on top of, right? And actually, if you're following the press today, some of the things that Napoleon sees from various countries and ended up in repositories, various museums, those are still being contested. I would say from the point of view, as a blanket statement, from the point of view of those who had things seized, they never felt that they were properly remunerated, right? And for those who did the seizing, they saw that as a consequence of war, right? And a just one, and that the upending of their material worlds was a part of the political choice they had made. Right? But the reverberations continue for a while.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk, Dr. White. I wanted to ask you about the knowledge part of your talk. I was so struck by what you said about folks in these various revolutions sort of coming to these engagements with a really deep understanding of objects and even what they're worth. But I wanted to ask you about moments maybe where you see in your sources people learning how to leverage objects better, either sort of these subsequent revolutions sort of learning from each other, or even commanders sort of learning, oh, okay, this is a better strategy for plundering, for example.
I think thank you. Throughout the war, you see military leaders, in the case of plunder, constantly trying to calibrate what to do. And often it is deeply circumstantial. So in the case of Washington, he's always concerned about plundering because he's fearful that plundering would drive folks into the loyalist camp, right? Since, especially in the early, since it is a messy war where allegiances are often shifting, right? That's a concern. If somebody has their property seized, then they and you can see some of this playing out with the ways that unauthorized plundering is punished in the military. But the constancy of those directives and calibrations of them, and when he allows plundering and when he doesn't, and other officers doing the same, you see how it's like a chronic problem from their point of view. But from the point of view of those who are doing the plundering, it's because they're being exposed to all this stuff. They know what it's worth and they know that it can sell. So for us, it introduces this other window that we wouldn't get. Like those ruptures provide us with an understanding of a kind of shared knowledge of the material world. And here I've emphasized market. In other chapters of the book, I look at what it means in terms of their understanding of personal identification with politics and how certain objects oppose to that. So this particular focus on ancien regime lets me do a particular move with luxury items and a world that seems in one sector, but we get inklings of it. We other people recognizing and participating, right? And they can use that to upend hierarchies. Other chapters explore how other types of objects, whether they be maps or wax figures, right, show us a different kind of knowledge and the ways that revolution affords some people opportunities and others not, to leverage that knowledge to a particular political end through the object. So yeah, so sorry, 7 chapters, like it's got like it goes through a lot of media, but that actually was a real fascination for me in terms of how certain types of objects do certain things for people at this time or have capacities that others don't. Anyway, I can talk to you more about this afterward. Thanks. No, thanks.
Hi, thank you again for coming to this talk and giving it for us. I have a dual part question. First, what was the object that kind of sparked you on this journey? And second, what was the favorite object that you uncovered in doing this?
The object that started the book project was a life-size wax figure of Toussaint Louverture that showed up in the United States and traveled as part of a show from 1802 to 1803. And I thought, I saw it and I was like, wow. When I came across the mention of it and then I started tracking the advertisements, one, because it was a wax figure, and actually Madame Tussaud gets her start in the French Revolution. She goes to Britain, and it's part of a larger phenomenon of wax shows emerging and then obviously continuing all the way up to today. But the fact that it was Toussaint Louverture, given my first book, was something that set it off. And then I just had to follow it. And so that was a particular hook into this project, although having gone to Winterthur and had the privilege of that training and exposure, I've always been interested in the ways that material life is so central to individuals, and thinking about how that is a powerful way for us to connect and understand those histories. I can't pick a favorite object. I have some favorite objects that didn't make it into the book that you feel really sad about. So maybe I'll do one of those, because they're all, I think actually what was so amazing for me is this book took me on paths I couldn't expect. And that was actually the best part of it, right? Stumbling into these new things. But one of the things that I came across were figurines of various revolutionary episodes, including Charlotte Corday murdering Marat, the famous David painting where he's in the bathtub, bleeding out. And it's at the hands of Charlotte Corday. And she also was a wax figure. But then these figurines were being produced in Britain. I was like, why? And they're fully clothed, like he's in a bathtub, like he's on a little dish of water, like not in a tub, and she is like looking really like something out of Bridgerton, and it's just and I wish I had like I don't know. I'm curious. I'm still really curious as to like what is the market for that thing, and why were they? Who wanted? Like who was the creator? Was like, well, this is going to sell, and so I mean, they're only like this high, and then what did it mean to have it in your parlor, right? So there's some of those kinds of things that are still kind of sneaking around in the brain, but didn't make it into the book. So I have a soft spot for some of those.
I was struck by the pit wax figure.
Yeah.
Where is that?
So that's in Westminster. That actually survives. That's by Patience Wright, who was an American wax sculptor. And during the colonial crisis, she migrated to London, which many American artists did, right? In an attempt to get more training, but also more exposure and clientele. And she does life-size wax figures of the king and queen. She does William Pitt, and then she starts doing Republicans, right? And then she sort of lines them up. And there's a rumor that she used her wax figures to stuff revolutionary information and tracts and to circulate them, right? But for me, those wax figures are so interesting in that several of them deal with violence during the Revolution, like the decapitation by guillotine of Louis XVI. And thinking about the difference between seeing that in the 1790s in the United States or Britain as a wax figure, sort of, versus a print, and the way that what that means experientially, and then the takeaway for understanding that kind of French revolutionary violence and the violence of the terror more broadly.
Are those wax? Are they from life? Are they sitting for these, or is this just her seeing them in person?
So sometimes people sat for them. Okay. In Madame Tussaud, when she's talking about her her wax figures, she says like, you can't really believe her memoirs, but she says like, I'm holding on my head, in my hands in my lap, the head of, Robespierre before. And she claims that so some of them she has seen, or she's visited them in prison and taken likenesses of them before they were executed. Whether that's like entirely believable, I'm not so sure. But I don't. But was it interesting in the case of accuracy with the visage? Maybe it was less to do with what they look like in terms of their faces, and more about the clothing. They spent a lot of time trying to get really accurate clothing, because in printed accounts, they detailed what folks wore. Like, what Louis XVI wore to his execution, right? So they invested a lot in the clothing, knowing that people would know what these people were supposed to be wearing. Like, viewers would understand that, and that would make it seem all the more real, along with the kind of eerie way that wax can imitate human flesh, right? Sorry.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. I have a whole list here that I could keep going through, but I was going to actually ask you about the George Washington image that you quickly went through there, and it did not look like George Washington at all.
No, it is. It doesn't look like him at all. Here, we can go back. Sorry. There we go. So no, if you saw that and it didn't have a label, you would be hard pressed to guess it's George Washington. And many other prints in this series do look nothing like actually the revolutionaries. And I actually think that's fantastic, because one of the things that people are trying to get to grips with during the revolutions are, what do these people look like? Many of them they had never seen. Might have heard of George Washington from the 7 Years' War, but that his portrait wasn't circulating in Europe. Neither was Jefferson's or even so. What you see then, and this is an early portrait, 1775, is that it looks nothing like him. But they've got him looking like a general. They have him looking pretty respectable. And apparently when he saw it, he was like, well, it doesn't look anything like me, but I look pretty good. It's not like a send up. It is honorable. Like, he looks like a general, right? Like, he's right. And that's a kind of a starting point for thinking about how with prints and printed portraits, what does it mean to see a revolutionary, and like, who gets to be seen and who doesn't? And this is because while I began with Auger and his printed portrait, there are very few printed portraits of Haitian revolutionaries. Those only emerge around 1802, when Toussaint Louverture dies. And there's a very specific political reason why they become in circulation in the Atlantic, which have to do with the Greater Dionysian. So like, who do you see, how do you see them, when you see them, and where, informs how people are praising revolutions. Like, Washington looks all right? They won't even want to see some of the Haitian revolutionaries until much later, right? Because of the emergence of that threat. So I tried to track, I use that kind of what seems like a mistake to open a sort of laundry list of questions about of who they see and why they need to be seen on particular terms at particular moments.
Oh, that's great. And actually, to share something here at the Presidential Library, I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but we were gifted this large collection of Washington medals and coins from the 18th century and into the 19th century. It's one of the largest collections of Washington kind of iconography like that ever collected. And there's a coin from Revolutionary France in which they're depicting Washington. They have no idea what George Washington actually looks like, and they depict him as a Roman general, a Cincinnatus. It looks nothing like him at all. So if you ever get a chance for an open house or a tour, take a look. It's right in the vault there. We have them on display.
I should have done coins.
Well, that's your next book, and I'll take you in there.
Done.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Ashley. This is great.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for coming out, folks.
And we have books available and signing for those that are interested.